Hi, my name is Dr. Christine Bishara. I'm doing an interview today with HG Tudor. HG Tudor is a diagnosed narcissistic psychopath, and I wanted to interview him because he's provided so many valuable videos and he writes about narcissism. And I believe that his work is phenomenal in helping those people who are either involved with narcissists or interact with them on a daily basis. It's very helpful for them. And so I decided that I'd like to interview him and get feedback from him as to the workings of a narcissist. So HG, thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you about narcissistic personality disorder and how someone who does not know anything about it can see whether or not they're interacting with a person who has narcissistic personality disorder. I wanted to ask you first, because I know that the DSM lists narcissistic personality disorder in a more, I would say a general or a more the grandiose type. And just what I know more of narcissism, this is not necessarily how a lot of narcissists present. And I think many people don't realize that. So I'd love for you to tell me a little bit about your designation of narcissist, because I think it's really helpful and I think it's very easy to understand. So would love for you to talk to me a little bit about that.
Certainly. Well, it's an expansive topic and one that I could talk for hours. So I'll take you a brief run through. What I do, as you rightly identified, Christine, the DSM tends to focus more on the idea of it being some alpha male who's grandiose, that eats what he kills and tramples on people below him in the corporate ladder and thinks he's absolutely a gift to women and so forth. And there are lots of different types of narcissists. They will have certain similarities. There are common themes, the absence of emotional empathy being one, the need to be manipulative another, and the pursuit of what I call the prime aims, namely, we have to control people, we have to draw fuel from people, which is basically an emotional response from individuals that we have precipitated, which gives us validation. We seek character traits from people, which we commandeer for ourselves, and residual benefits, which gives a wide range of things such as money, great sex, access to networks, somebody to scratch your back, somebody to do your laundry, and so on and so forth. But amongst all of the different narcissists, I've classified them into 4 schools, namely lesser, mid-range, greater, and ultra, and cadres, which include and are victim, somatic, cerebral, and elite. Now, in essence, the cadres are preferences. So somatic narcissists are guided and want the material, the visual. Cerebral, as the name suggests, it's all about the mind. Victim basically presents as a quite a pathetic character that needs to be mothered, that needs things done for them. They're often serial complainers. And elite is an amalgam of both somatic and the cerebral. There's obviously a lot more that I can tell you about those cadres. With the schools, in essence, lesser narcissists don't operate with facades. They tend to be like the wrecking balls. They are fairly obvious individuals, full of themselves. Lower lesser being an out-and-out loser, a middle lesser, similarly a bit of a loser, but tends to have more sulky behaviors associated with them. Both will use physical violence. Upper lesser A is basically your affable arsehole, someone who's often quite charismatic, somebody who may well know a lot of people and can often be quite successful, but they're utterly transparent, superficial, and never to be relied upon. Upper lesser type B is your bold, belligerent, boasting bastard, who it's my way or the highway. You're weak, I'm strong, I'm big, you're small. You got it wrong, get out of here. You're useless, you're fired. And again, they can be pretty successful. They tend to be less charismatic than the upper lesser, which is the A, as I've just mentioned. With mid-range, this is where you find your more passive-aggressive narcissists. And lower mid-range is an amalgam of both lesser and mid-range, operates an intermittent facade. So think of a strip light that keeps flickering on and off. So the type of individual who believes themselves to be a decent person, and when they lose their temper, it's just caused by other people making them lose their temper. They don't realize that it's their narcissism at work. And the lower mid-ranger may use physical violence, is often verbally abusive, and they are the type of individual where they're known for having a bit of edge about them. They're known, for instance, that, yeah, he could generally be okay, but you want to be careful because sometimes he can really kick off and there'll be a fight in a bar, that type of thing. Middle mid-range A and B are the most passive aggressive. These are often false empaths. They think that they're empathic people. The A is the overwhelming angel, a helicoptering parent, for example, the individual who is the bastion of the local community, always interfering in other people's business and can't see that what they do lacks boundary recognition, that they gossip behind people's backs, but they think they're really decent people. Middle mid-range type B is the crybaby. The world is against them and the universe has cursed them. Upper mid-range, haughty, arrogant, but often pretty good achievers, sometimes get mistaken for greater narcissists. They operate with a facade of superiority. Finally, we have the graters. Lower greater, middle greater, and upper greater. Lower greater tends to be the most aggressive of the graters. These are aware narcissists. Lesser and mid-range don't know what they are. Graters do. Your lower mid-range is often found in politics and military, quite aggressive, quite in your face, but eminently successful, substantial reach, often pretty charismatic, but in a sort of almost rough diamond kind of way, often successful and will hold powerful positions. Middle graters, hugely charismatic, often seen in the spiritual realm, in religion, pop stars, entertainers. And upper graters, they tend to be the very calculating mind, politics, often an eminence grise, somebody that moves between the lines, pulling the puppet strings, not necessarily that bothered about fame, is more concerned with the wielding power, often behind the scenes. And often upper graters are people that aren't really known about, come from particularly wealthy banking backgrounds, wealthy European families, for instance, that have always been there, that people don't really know a lot, quite secretive. So those are, that's a very quick run through the various classifications that I utilize. And through a narc detector, which is a service that I offer, I determine if somebody is a narcissist operating to strict evidential standards. So I assess the evidence, is it credible? And if it is, does this mean that this person's a narcissist? And if so, what are the reasons why and which type they are? And it provides people with those categorizations. And the reason why I use these categorizations was to help people understand that there are different types of narcissists that have similarities but operate in different ways, and that existing descriptions were too broad and unhelpful. And this helps people understand the range of behaviors in terms of what the narcissist will do, but just as importantly, what the narcissist is unlikely or won't do, because certain narcissists operate in different ways. So I came up with this classification, which makes it easier for people to understand the different types of narcissists in a language which they can understand, because I'm not a psychologist. And so therefore I don't utilize esoteric language that's linked to science and so forth, but it is predicated on the science that's there and is done in a way that people can grasp and apply to their own understanding.
That's really good to know. And I think your classification, in my opinion, is brilliant because it is so easy to understand. And I think so many people don't realize that they're dealing with narcissists, number one, because as you said, the DSM is so broad, but also the DSM states that about 1% of the population is narcissist, which I think is grossly underestimated, partly because of the fact that number one, they don't usually seek treatment or diagnosis because like you said, 99% of them, right, are unaware that they're actually narcissists, except for the graders.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and I think like, for example, the mid-rangers are passive aggressive. They look like empaths. They look like really good people. And so someone might not necessarily know that they're dealing with someone like that. And then they start getting manipulated and feeling this is not really a weird, this is going, a weird relationship. And this spreads across, it's not just romantic relationships, it spreads across, having a boss who's a mid-range narcissist, or people that you interact with on a daily basis, or even family members. I feel like all of us somehow have a family member, whether or not it's the, primary family or extended family. I feel like everyone has dealt with a narcissist in their family, my opinion anyway. But I did want to talk to you about the making of a narcissist, because I know that most mental health professionals will say that it's due to childhood trauma. But I'd love to get your feedback, because I know that you have been involved with a lot of narcissists growing up in a narcissistic family. So tell me what you think is the main risk factor for development of narcissistic personality disorder.
There are essentially two factors. The first is a genetic predisposition towards narcissism, the seed, if you will. So there's likely to be a narcissist elsewhere in the family, might be immediately above one of the parents or both parents, grandfather or grandmother, or even further back. And that genetic predisposition is passed on. So that means that that child has the potential to become a narcissist. If that genetic predisposition is missing, you won't get a narcissist. If it's there, it doesn't mean you're guaranteed to get one. It just means that there is a potential for a narcissist to come along. You then need the soil, which is a lack of control environment. And there are lots of different lack of control environments. A child being physically abused, a child being sexually abused, a child that's being neglected, a child that's not given emotional support, a child that grows up in a gilded environment. So the child that's told that they are brilliant, even when they're actually not. A child that's always told, well, it's good, but close, but no cigar. You scored 2 goals, why didn't you score 3? You got 75% in your examination, why didn't you get 80%? Grade B syndrome, as I call it. There's lots of different types of lack of control environment. So if you have a child that's brought up in the lack of control environment but does not have the genetic predisposition, they will not be a narcissist. But if you have a child that has both genetic predisposition allied with a lack of control environment, and they are subjected to that lack of control environment for a specific period, or a sustained period of time, rather, between the ages of 0 and 9, a narcissist will be created. Now, an analogy is like baking a cake. You have your narcissist ingredients, that's the genetic predisposition, and then you have an oven that's at a set temperature, and the mix goes in there for a set period of time. If you've got the right ingredients with the right temperature and the right duration, lo and behold, a narcissist arrives. You've got the genetic predisposition and lack of control environment. If you don't have the right ingredients, but you've got the right temperature and you've got the right duration, still no narcissist. If somebody keeps coming along and taking the cake mix out of the oven, known as an intervener, no narcissist. So an intervener, such as the other parent who might not be a narcissist, a grandparent or school, that in effect shields the child from the sustained exposure to the lack of control environment, may well prevent them from becoming a narcissist. Now, it's also worth pointing out that in the creation of a narcissist, you don't necessarily have to have a poor home background. As I mentioned, there's the gilded environment, but you could also have a narcissist created where 2 parents are empaths, or 2 normal people, or a normal and empath. The genetic predisposition hasn't come from them, it's come from further back in the lineage. So it's skipped a generation or 2 and it's there within the child. Child has a supportive home background. Therefore, there's no lack of control environment. But if that child could be exposed to almost like a flash frying, quick fry, with the cooking analogy again, where they're exposed to something that's so traumatic that it creates in an instant the narcissism. So for instance, they witness both their parents being killed in a home invasion, or they're subjected to particular sexual abuse by, let's say, a sports coach or something like that. So nothing to do with the home environment, but that lack of control environment that's so intense in that instance, allied with that genetic predisposition, creates a narcissist. And I have a specific video that goes into this in greater detail, but that's essentially what forms a narcissist. So for me, it arose from a genetic predisposition combined with the environment in which I found myself as a child.
You talk about environment. So, there's so much with like entitlement syndrome, right? Where I think it's more pervasive nowadays, where parents kind of have this child who's like the golden child, and they're entitled and treated like they're perfect, like you said. And then I think they just kind of don't grow up learning how to deal with conflict. Would you consider that also a lack of control environment?
Yes, because the child doesn't actually exercise any control. Everything's given to them on a silver platter. They're not able to make decisions for themselves. They're told, this is what's happening, this is why that's done, and they're given everything. They don't need to work things out for themselves. So that element of control as a child learns about navigating their way through the world.
Yeah,
they're not given that.
Right.
So it's if you like, it's a sort of strange benign form of lack of control, in that
Yeah.
You know, they grow up in a house where they've got food and it's warm and they've well clothed and they've got lots of toys,
Yeah.
but they can never do anything for themselves. You know, they're always monitored when they go out. They're told that they're brilliant when actually they're not really achieving things. They never really have to try to get to anything because it's just given to them on a plate. And so they don't, they have no control over their life.
You know, it's interesting that you say that. I think about children who are celebrities, like child stars, and we know so many grow up to be, I'm sorry to say, like messed up. And I wonder if, you know, that plays a huge role if they have that genetic predisposition and then combined with that environment, that would explain things, right?
Well, indeed. So you have a narcissist parent who will invariably live vicariously through their child.
Exactly.
And so the children are just little mirrors. They're extensions of the parental narcissist.
Yeah.
So they pass that genetic predisposition onto their child. And then it might be that, for instance, the parental narcissist looks like the back end of a bus, isn't particularly attractive, but by some quirk of nature, their child looks like a little blonde-haired, blue-eyed angel and is very, very bonny. And in those circumstances, it lends themselves to thinking, right, let's put them into these ridiculous pageants and so forth. So they get thrust into that environment because the ugly parent then lives through the beauty of the child. It shows that they have, you know, this girl is wearing makeup and these dresses which are entirely inappropriate for their age. They are given no choice as to whether they compete in these things, and they're told, "Oh, you're so beautiful. You know, God cried when He created you," and all this type of slather that's provided. And the child grows up with an entitlement and is made to believe that they're ultra special, and therefore has a huge amount of conceit. And that genetic predisposition, which of course has been passed down from the parental narcissist, combines with that lack of control environment. Namely, you've been put on this earth to walk around as like an angel that's beautiful and amazing and wonderful, but you go in all these competitions, you do as I tell you, and you're not allowed to eat those things because you're not allowed to put weight on, and no, you can't play out with your friends because if you fall off your go-kart and bump your face, you can't go in these competitions. So that child has no control over their life.
Makes sense.
So so as Philip Larkin once memorably wrote, they fuck you up, your mum and dad. So no, and then it's likely that child becomes a narcissist.
Well, and again, this is really why I wanted to do this interview with you, because you know, I think all parents should have some kind of course where they take before, you know, like they have Lamaze classes before you give birth. Well, I think this is so vital, and for people also to know to look for a narcissist. Because if you grew up in a narcissistic family, guess what? You're going to be attracted to that narcissist as a friend, as a romantic partner, and you know the work environment may cause you to interact with a narcissist boss who, you know, sees that in you. But you know, and that kind of brings me to my next question, which is that spectrum, right? Where you talk about on the two ends of the spectrum, there's the empath on one side and the narcissist on the other, and then in between are the normals and the narcissistic individuals. Again, brilliant breakdown. You know, I as much as I respect psychiatry and the DSM, I just feel like for the lay person, it's just not easily understood. And I think so many people don't realize that they're in these toxic relationships with, you know, as I said, romantic partners, bosses, family members. So maybe real quick, I know this is a very heavy topic, but maybe real quick, kind of just describe that spectrum that you talk about, and also why narcissists tend to prey on empaths for you know, for the prime aims that you speak about.
So I'd categorize into 4 categories. So there's the narcissist, which is an individual that has narcissistic personality disorder, and you either are one or you aren't. So when you are a narcissist, there's no narcissist is more of a narcissist than another narcissist. You are a narcissist. We then have narcissistic people who aren't narcissists, but they have low emotional empathy, strong narcissistic traits, weak empathic traits. They are manipulative and they know that they are. Then we have normals, the largest group on the planet, who have both empathic and narcissistic traits, but they tend to be low to moderate in strength. They have emotional empathy, and they'll have substantial emotional empathy for what I call the circle of empathy, a small group of people around them, their parents, their children, their siblings, a neighbor, colleagues, and friends. But they don't tend to have that expansive emotional empathy for the little orphan boy in Rwanda or the homeless guy in the city center. Then we have the empath group. Again, a group that has both empathic and narcissistic traits. The empathic traits will always outrank the narcissistic traits. The empathic traits will be from moderate to extremely high. The narcissistic traits could be anything from very low all the way up to very high, but they'll always be outranked by the empathic traits. Empaths have considerable amount of emotional empathy for a wide range of people, and they also have the addiction to the narcissist. And that means that the symbiotic relationship between narcissist and empath is such that a narcissist is drawn to an empath because the empath caters to the prime aims better than any other classification of person. So a normal can cater to the prime aims. A narcissistic person will cater to the prime aims. Another narcissist will cater to the prime aims, but none do so well as the empath. And with the empath, what they do is they're drawn unconsciously to the narcissist because of the presence of their addiction, which makes them easier to get under control and easier to keep under control. And that's why we hunt either consciously, where an aware narcissist, or unconsciously, where an unaware narcissist, the empathic individual.
Interesting. And the empath, you say, is addicted to the narcissist. Is that mainly because the empath in general wants to help and save others? So it's almost like this.
Well, that's part, yes, that's part of it.
Yeah.
The addiction stems in essence from the need to flex their empathic traits such as compassion, caring, truth seeker, strong moral compass, decency, and so forth. So being with a narcissist allows that empath to flex those traits to the greatest extent. Why? We are essentially dishonest. That gives the trait of honesty a run out. Many narcissists present as broken people. That gives the desire to fix and heal a good run out. Some narcissists need to be cared for. Therefore, the empathic trait of caring is given a good run out. So basically, the narcissist allows the empath to be the empath to the greatest extent.
Yeah.
Also, some empaths are imprinted because of what's happened to them, that they've had a parental narcissist, for example. Therefore, narcissism feels like home. They end up chasing the storm as an adult that they experienced as a child. And it feels they don't know any different in essence.
Right. And the subconscious brain is amazing. It's constantly looking for patterns, and it recognizes these patterns consciously, right? So you're going to attract a narcissist without you even realizing it, just because that pattern or that behavior is familiar from your childhood or not.
Yeah.
So, brilliant. Curious. I think we kind of talked about this a little bit. I think the 1% is grossly underestimated. I think I would at least a fourth to a third of the population has narcissistic personality disorder. What do you think?
I put it at around about a sixth.
Okay.
There's always going to be an argument, of course, because there'll be some who will say that there are subclinical narcissists, which I would describe as narcissistic individuals. But the number of narcissists is far higher than people realize, for part of the reason that you alluded to earlier, Christine, namely, they won't often present in therapy. And also the ones that do can often be quite good at convincing therapists, etc., that there's nothing wrong with them, it's the other person that's the problem. And certain narcissists are so very good at fitting in that they go undetected. And often, of course, what happens is this. The society uses terms such as she's high maintenance, he has anger management issues, she's hypersensitive, he's a commitment phobe. And they're often describing narcissists, but they're not actually describing narcissists. So they don't use the terminology. So people just think, oh, that person, you know, he just can never settle down. And actually, he's got a string of broken relationships because he's got no emotional empathy and he cheats repeatedly. All of those things being narcissistic indicators. And it's highly likely that he is a narcissist because he behaves in that fashion. But nobody calls him that, because of stupid television programs and films which euphemize the behaviors and describe it as something else.
Absolutely.
And it's not helped, of course, by certain books that tell you if you want to get hold of a man or a woman, you treat them this way. They are basically books written by narcissists with a skewed view of relationships, telling people this is how you go about it. And so they think, oh, that's not toxic. That's the way that you do it to get a relationship. No. That's the seduction modus operandi of a narcissist, and it passes into the mainstream with people thinking, for example, Oh, right. Yeah. Treat them mean to keep them keen, those kind of principles and so forth. And, don't answer immediately, keep them hanging on. Those are the types of things that narcissists do.
Right. And it doesn't work with narcissists. So yeah. Okay. So all that being said, if you had to kind of give people who really don't know what they're dealing with 5 red flags or 5 easy ways to spot a narcissist, go.
Well, it would depend at what stage of the relationship you're involved. So at the beginning, it would be, are they looking to monopolize your time? Are they excessive in their flattery? Do they smear, for instance, the ex excessively in terms of saying that he or she was a nutcase and a crazy psycho, and if they get in touch with you, don't listen to what they've got to say? Okay. Do they engage in financial largesse, for instance, or are they particularly tight with their money? And is it the case that they've got, for instance, they suddenly disappear and you don't know where they've got to, that there's a sudden period where they're in your face and ringing you with lots of messages and pester, and then all of a sudden you don't hear from them. Those are 5 indicators. Understand that if you find somebody with all 5, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a narcissist. You need to look at the behavior over a sustained period of time to make a determination, but you need to start asking questions if you do see those things.
Okay. So what did you say? You said excessive time in the beginning and flattery, right?
I said monopolization of time, excessive flattery, financial largesse, or being tight with their money, smearing of the ex, and a series of many relationships which have as a nature.
And silent treatment, you said, right? Where they disappear.
And then you have the what people colloquially would refer to as ghosting, or the fact that they're in your face and then suddenly they disappear.
Right. Okay. Curious about you, HG, because I know you're a diagnosed narcissist, but you're also a diagnosed psychopath. So when did you, and you're part of that percentage that is self-aware, which is, less than 1% of narcissists.
Yes.
So when, I'm just curious, when did you realize that you were a narcissist or had, the behavior consistent with that? I'm curious, like, what your story is.
Well, I've always known that I was different and set apart and above people. I've always known that my emotional responses are completely different to many other people. I would look at certain behaviors and wonder, why is that person behaving that way? I don't understand. But then because of my cognitive function, I very quickly understood. My siblings often thought that I was like an alien that was learning how to be a human being, but I learned very, very quickly how to fit in. So an obvious example of that was I once asked my sister, why is water leaking from that person's face? And she said, those are tears, HG. I said, well, what's all that about in essence? And it was quite fascinating witnessing the weakness of an individual that water trickles down their face because somebody said something to them that they didn't like. So I've always known that I've been different, as I say, and set apart. I just didn't have a term for what I am. I knew, for instance, that I enjoyed hurting people. I got off on manipulating. I found it amusing to mess with people's lives. I found that if somebody did something that I didn't like, it was necessary for me to punish them and exact retribution upon them. I realized that I needed control over individuals in one shape or form. I realized that the emotional response of individuals made me feel powerful, which of course is fuel. I didn't know it was called that at the time. I coined that term later on. So I had all of these instances, I had all of the pieces, but I didn't have a label for it all. And basically, a former girlfriend of mine who's a psychology graduate once said to me, without judgment, HG, you are both a narcissist and you have an antisocial personality disorder, you're a psychopath. And I said, well, that's very interesting. Do tell me more, which was me asserting control over her by neither accepting it, but wanting to understand more because I have a huge intellectual curiosity for things. She sat down and explained it to me. And I said, well, that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I must be about other matters, toodle pip. And away I went. And much of what she said resonated with me, but I wasn't going to admit that to her because then that would be transferring power to her. And I then had a label for what I was.
Very interesting. Okay. And I know that you're in treatment, right?
Well, that's what they like to think.
All right, say no more, HG. I want to kind of touch upon the medical aspects of narcissism and what it causes. As a wellness physician, I always want to look at root cause of everything. And so I know that narcissistic personality disorder puts those who are suffering from it, especially males for some reason, I believe there's a link to testosterone, but tend to have more chronic medical conditions, one of them being heart disease. And I attribute it, and I think I've read articles to point to this, that that emptiness that you talk about, that feeling of emptiness, which I think you have the antisocial aspects, so you probably don't have it as much, but I think most narcissists have this emptiness and anxiety and almost like this stirring deep down, right, of the narcissism trying to get its fuel, as you say. I think that emptiness is like this stress releasing condition where they're constantly releasing cortisol. And we know cortisol is a stress hormone, and prolonged release of cortisol tends to put us in inflammation and lead us to having chronic illnesses, one of which is heart disease. I'm sure it's linked to a lot of other things, but I think the studies so far have linked, heart disease to males with narcissistic personality disorder. So I'd love for you to kind of tell me about what that emptiness is. Like, what does it feel like? Is it just this kind of just fire that just isn't quenched? Or, tell me a little bit about that what most narcissists feel inside.
Well, there's a distinction in a sense, because we would look at a pure psychopath, then there's me as the hybrid narcissistic psychopath, and then there's the pure narcissist. So a pure narcissist has this experience of the emptiness, and as you rightly identify, this link to anxiety. So this emptiness is a problem for them, that their narcissism fights against it. That the emptiness is basically oblivion, a chasm of nothingness. And when that fuel level drops, that emptiness makes its presence felt. It starts as a sense of unease, and then becomes like an itch that you can't quite scratch. And the narcissist will start to feel anxious, will start to feel concerned, but doesn't know what's actually causing it, where it's an unaware narcissist. Should fuel levels start to plummet further, there's this sense of impending doom, like the world is going to come crashing in, a huge sense of vulnerability, and it can lead to a panic attack as the anxiety increases. So the narcissism needs to lead the narcissist away from that, to seek out fuel and to assert control, to prevent that chasm in effect from reaching up and swallowing the narcissist, which would result in the construct, the false self, no longer functioning. It would be collapsing on itself, in a sense, into that chasm that's there. So the presence of the emptiness is there in terms of making the narcissist sort of feel skittish and anxious and so forth. And therefore, they are driven to behave in a particular way to ensure that they get that fuel, which is like pouring oil on troubled waters. It then soothes their fevered brow, it eases the anxiety, which falls away. And the more of this fuel that they receive, as they start to fill up from it, the emptiness recedes for a period of time, but it never truly goes away. And then they start to feel a little more comfortable, and then they might start to feel more powerful. And if they're particularly well fueled, you might see certain narcissists, they almost appear like they're fizzing, because the level of power that they're experiencing flowing through their veins from all this fuel makes them feel superhuman and invulnerable, a colossus that's striding the world. So you have that now. A psychopath embraces the emptiness, doesn't need to fight against it, because a psychopath doesn't need fuel. So the psychopath occupies the emptiness, is comfortable with that. It doesn't cause the skittishness, because the psychopath doesn't experience the anxiety, doesn't experience the processing of fear in the way that others do. I lack the anxiety and lack the fear. That's that side of things for me. And I have a degree of comfort with the emptiness, that I embrace it and recognize that's just what I am, that there is nothing there, and that doesn't concern me. However, I do need fuel because of the narcissistic side of me, but I don't need it as often or as much as a pure narcissist does. So there are periods of time where I could be on my own for an extended period of time without suffering the skittishness and the anxiety that a pure narcissist would experience.
Very interesting. And you call that emptiness, especially when it kind of really drains and they're not getting that fuel, which basically in essence is narcissism, right? It's that need for control to kind of fuel you up. You call it fuel crisis. And you know, I've listened to a lot of your videos. You know, the lessers are really not aware of what's going on at all, and they kind of dip into the fuel crisis more often than the mid-range, who still, you know, have those fuel crises occasionally, but less than the lessers. So it's really fascinating and interesting. And I know we're kind of pressed for time, so I'm going to kind of move on to my last question, which is related medically. But and you know, I am not advocating for anyone to go out and use illicit drugs such as, you know, psychedelics or anything like that. These are just studies that I've come across where there's some success in treating narcissism, because we know that narcissistic personality disorder is not treatable. However, recent research has shown that intense psychotherapy coupled with a one-time administration of psychedelic drugs, LSD, magic mushrooms, psilocybin, have actually shown that some people are able to be cured of their narcissism. And they attribute that to the fact that we know narcissism or narcissists, excuse me, do not have any empathy. And when they use these substances, you know, part of the effects of these substances is they create this feeling of awe and connectedness and increase your empathy. And so during this intense psychotherapy, where they're doing the psychotherapy, but they're also coupling it with this, a narcissist is able to kind of see the world view in a much bigger realm than just their own little world. And there have been some, you know, studies that show that it helps. Obviously, it's still a kind of a work in progress. But I guess my question to you is, what do you think of that? And if that was something that became a more mainstream treatment, would you be interested in getting treatment for your narcissism, or do you enjoy having narcissistic personality disorder?
Well, the first thing is, in order to comment on it, I'd have to look at it in greater detail to understand precisely what's been said about it. It might be that the individuals haven't got narcissistic personality disorder and they're subclinical, they're narcissistic, and that's why it breaks through, because you can't inject emotional empathy into somebody who's not got it. So if it's enhancing it in some way, it must already be there, which would suggest perhaps they're not narcissists. But as I've mentioned, I'd have to look at it in greater detail to comment more fully. If there was a treatment available, the short answer is no, I would not be interested. I'm perfectly effective as I am.
Interesting. Well, and just so you, I guess, because you brought that up, and maybe people who are watching or listening don't know the difference. So you describe a narcissist as somebody with no empathy at all, a narcissistic individual as somebody with very low empathy, but still a little bit.
Correct. That's right.
Yeah, that makes sense, actually. That's interesting. So, okay, well, if you do have time to read up on that, please do.
Why don't you send me the studies, and I'll take a look at them.
I will. And thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview. I think it's going to be helpful.
Not at all. My pleasure.
And thank you again.